I used to not even lock my doors.
Between the signs, security cameras, and four-legged guard, Darlene Bruening hopes the measures will keep her safe. Because on June 19th, 2020...
Remember the gunshots? I remember everybody running like crazy. You know, and we had just brought our great-grandson in the house.
Bruening also remembers her great-grandson Theodore pointing to media right outside the crime tape that surrounded her house the very next day. What had started as a daytime gathering in Seymour Park ended with a shootout, leaving one person dead and 2 injured. As for the man who died that night, Bruening found his body in her backyard.
Just being a Greenbay resident, have you noticed, more newspaper headlines or more local news headlines about violent crimes happening?
Absolutely. A lot more gun crime.
That we have seen, I think, nationwide increase is person-to-person violence, in particular gun crime. There's a lot of the same folks that are involved in a lot of this activity is actually a very small group of people here.
So was the case in the Seymour Park shooting. It means what's largely responsible for a jump in certain crimes in Greenbay comes down to a handful of individuals. Greenbay Police Chief Chris Davis explains in part how else the pandemic could impact crime in the area.
It's like the risk calculation changed. And so before, if I was feuding with somebody and and the way a lot of these situations start is a feud starts over Facebook and somebody disses somebody else and then somebody comes and commits an act of violence and then there's this retaliation and it's this cycle of violence.
The theory backs up some crime stats pulled from Greenbay Police in a record request. The data shows 1 murder in 2018, 3 in 2019, and 6 murders in 2020. Recorded sex offenses took a slight decline over the past 3 years, 146 in 2018, 134 in 2019, and 132 in 2020. And keeping with crimes against people, assault offenses hailed the largest numbers, 1,394 in 2018, 1,452 in 2019, then down to 1,252 in 2020. That downward trend continued for other crimes.
Property crimes, for example, residential burglaries, commercial burglaries. Some of that probably is because, in the case of residential burglaries, people were home more.
Going back to the numbers, burglary stats went from 257 in 2018 down to 247 in 2019 and down again to 209 in 2020. While Greenbay continues to study its public safety, Appleton Police reveals an unsurprising impact.
One stat we did see that was a little higher is suicide rates.
Lieutenant Megan Cash says Appleton residents can expect to see more mental health awareness campaigns. She adds there have been other crime increases, but none that she would attribute to COVID-19.
So one thing that we've seen that there was a very slight increase was in intimidation. So it'd be more of the sometimes an enhancer or something added to a charge.
Can you kind of give me an example of what intimidation looks like in action?
Sure. So an intimidation could be trying to encourage somebody not to report a crime, or once they have reported that crime and they are a victim of that crime, to try to convince them not to testify in court.
So what do you say to those who assume that there would be some kind of increase in violence because of the pandemic and its impact on people?
I think that the impact on people is definitely something that we saw. But I think that pulling together as a community and really looking at how can we help one another is something that really helped us here in Appleton.
After 2 shootings in 1 week, leaving bullet holes in the windows of this Greenbay home on Hubbard Street, City Alder Brian Johnson wants to find solutions to respond to this increase in gun violence.
People are unsettled in their neighborhoods. It's in our job as elected officials to really calm those fears and provide solutions and solve the problem, and that's what I'm looking to do.
That's why Johnson's proposing the city creates a gun violence task force.
Look, we have to really get at the heart of what's happening, right? I mean, in some instances, there are systemic problems. In other instances, they are transient problems. And so we really need to have everybody represented at the table to address all of the different reasons these shootings are happening so that the solution and the response is appropriate.
It's a problem Greenbay police are all too familiar with, as they told Fox 11 in an interview in late October.
And we are still seeing what to us is an unusually high volume of calls involving guns, involving shots fired, people threatened with firearms, and those kind of things.
Greenbay police were unavailable for an on-camera interview, but tell Fox 11 they welcome the idea of a gun violence task force. and that Chief Chris Davis and Mayor Eric Genrich's office are working on a comprehensive gun violence reduction plan, including assigning officers to more permanent gun violence reduction assignments and making requests to use American Rescue Plan Action funding to help.
Look, I think it's important to recognize task forces in and of themselves are not solutions. Task forces gather information and make recommendations. And then it's incumbent upon the elected body to act on those recommendations.
Hospitals across the state are overwhelmed with patients. So much so, some have turned people away.
And even recently, on a single day here in Greenbay, one of our hospitals had to say no to 28 patients being transferred in that needed them, including 3 strokes.
Dr. Ashok Rai with Prevea Health says some patients had to be transferred to hospitals hundreds of miles away to receive care.
This wouldn't happen if we had those beds and the staff available to take care of them, which are now being occupied by COVID patients.
Dr. Robert Mead with Bellin Health says their hospitalization numbers are as high as they were in November of 2020. He says a quarter of their beds are occupied by COVID patients.
It has caused significant difficulties with managing beds. We've had to double up beds, so people are sharing rooms, and something we don't like to do, but we're forced to do that now.
Mead says Bellin has also hired a number of traveling nurses to help with staffing constraints. At Theta Care, Lynn Detterman says hospital workers spend a portion of their day dealing with bed management.
So I was in the elevator just 2 hours ago, and I heard 2 nurses say, our day is discharge, admit, which meant that, the patients are just coming in as fast as we can, discharge them. And it's been that way for a few months.
Detterman says Theta Care is working hard to support their staff during this time.
We know there's a national labor shortage. We know there's a significant, portion of people leaving healthcare, right? Because they are really struggling with all of these stresses. And so we are doing a lot of creative things in our health system to try to help our team members through that.
Healthcare systems say they're doing the best they can to continue to care for their communities.